worst thing you can do that causes the most accidents that drivers should avoid?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think when we think about safety from insurance perspective or in general from safety perspective, there's two main avenues we think about it. One is around just the complexities around road safety and how does a driver become safer on the road. And then the second aspect, particularly in the rideshare space, is about the interpersonal conflict safety, which is, the rider-driver safety, which plays a huge role on both for the rider, the driver, as well as the rideshare companies involved. So on the road safety front, I think, as Ryan pointed out, our mission is always to kind of think about how to make the world's roads safer. So we actually look at a ton of data. We look at it from the perspective of the driver risk. What can the drivers do to kind of improve their situation? But we also look at it from the perspective of, the vehicles that they're driving. What are the vehicles like, and how much safety do the vehicles actually bring to the table? And then the third sort of aspect we look at is just the road risk. Are the types of roads people driving on actually more risky? Maybe some regionality involved there. So to go to your question around what can the drivers do, kind of focus towards the driver risk, there's a lot that we look at, and not all solution fits for every driver. There's some drivers that are just harsh brakers and habitual brakers. There's some that engage in a ton of phone distraction. So some of the technology that we bring to the table kind of looks at that whole overall landscape and provides kind of targeted sort of behavioral changes and coaching that really makes sense for that driver. One solution kind of doesn't fit for every single driver, and that's something we've learned over time, especially looking at our data.
Gotcha. So I guess, it's interesting that you mentioned, the three different aspects of driver behavior, the vehicles. I guess certain things, drivers can control, right? I already have a vehicle, for example, that I'm driving Uber and Lyft. I might want a safer or a nicer one, but it might be cost prohibitive to upgrade. I might live in a certain area. So it's interesting that there's certain things like if you drive day or night, for example, right? That would be one good example. You kind of do have control over that, even though you might make more money at night, but is it worth it, right? Like I'm imagining there might be more accidents at night. We just did a video and an article about, is it worth it to drive during a snowstorm? Because during snowstorms, drivers, there are a lot more people need rides, and when it's raining, inclement weather, right? There's fewer drivers out on the road, so you can actually make a lot of money, but, there might be more risk, especially with snow. So I'm curious how you think about, sort of balancing some of those kind of preferences versus, the potential to make more money. What do you think drivers should think about?
Yeah, absolutely. When we think about risk too, we think about intrinsic risk and extrinsic risk. Intrinsic is something the driver can actually control, and extrinsic are controls that are obviously out of their control. So some of the things, as you mentioned, like braking or phone distraction, that's entirely in driver's control as much as possible. I mean, we understand in rideshare too, sometimes they are distracted to try and get the next ride. And so there's oftentimes those situations they're getting into that sort of necessity of the job. But a lot of these things are in control. And as you mentioned, there are some of the extrinsic risks which we actually put out of the box, like in general, like what are the road types like, or even small things like we look at even sun glare. If they're driving in dusk or dawn times, the lighting conditions, do those things matter? And what we find is that even those small variables have an impact on risk. But oftentimes it's not under driver's control to really change that.
So if there was one thing that you thought drivers should focus on, what would be the one thing that maybe sort of helps them drive a little safer, maybe prevent accidents? Is there one thing you could pick?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think phone distraction is such a huge prevalent reason. It's just growing over time. And I think over COVID times, Ryan, you may know the numbers off the top of your head, but the amount of fatalities we've seen have really gone up in really high rates. And so I think that's one space where I think particularly rideshare drivers could really make a difference, because their job often calls for being a little bit distracted. You'll have to kind of work with these rideshare companies to figure out how to best come up with solutions that can limit that as much as possible. And I think drivers should try and limit that type of phone distraction as much as possible.
Yeah, I think a couple of quick things. The road fatality number, it's a 16-year high on fatalities. So knowing that that's the case is critical. And oftentimes we're talking about what the driver can and can't control. One of the things they certainly can control is defensive driving too, right? So you can't count on the other drivers to see you. today. And you can't count on the fact that your passengers also may not also be aware that there are drivers out there that are distracted, right?
Yeah.
So Harry, you're still a driver, so you drive from time to time. So I'll talk, friend to friend in this case. I would say as much as possible, as many things as you can remove from your tasks while you are actually physically driving the vehicle, whether that be phone distraction or otherwise, is really critical, really, really important.